Chapter 1. The Return of Gunnar and Eli. The air was thick with tension. The ruins of the old agency outpost stood silent around the two teams, a haunting reminder of all they had lost. Sofia leaned against a crumbling wall, her eyes scanning the horizon. Somewhere out there, Gunnar was returning, or so they had been told. Alex paced nearby, her fingers absent-mindedly grazing the hilt of her blade. "He'll come," she muttered to no one in particular, though her words carried the weight of both hope and doubt. Karina, always the quiet one, stood ready, her katana balanced across her back, her gaze fixed on the sky. Suddenly, a crackle of energy rippled through the air. The sky above shimmered, bending as though reality itself was tearing apart. A brilliant light exploded in the center of the field, and from its core, two figures stepped forward. Gunnar stood tall, battle-worn but alive, the faint glow of the Starlight Gem pulsing in his hand. Beside him was Eli, draped in shadows, her presence both mysterious and commanding. Ashley was the first to speak, her voice shaky but filled with relief. "Gunnar, you made it." Gunnar's gaze swept across his old comrades, each face etched with disbelief, relief, and curiosity. "I told you I'd come back," he said, his voice carrying a weariness that only those who've seen too much can bear. Sofia stepped forward, her eyes locking onto the stranger beside him. "Who is she?" "This is Eli," Gunnar said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Without her, I wouldn't be here. She helped me retrieve the Starlight Gem. She's one of us now." Karina's hand hovered near her sword, her eyes narrowing. "One of us? Just like that?" Eli stepped forward, her voice calm and clear. "I understand your hesitation, but I am bound to this gem. Your world. It needs this power to survive what's coming, and I will help, as long as you let me." There was a beat of silence as the teams exchanged glances, the tension hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Finally, Ashley stepped forward, breaking the silence. "If Gunnar trusts you, that's good enough for me." Sofia nodded. "We've been through enough to know when help is genuine, but if you betray us—" "I won't," Eli said softly, her gaze steady. "We're all in this together now." Chapter 2. Sofia's Briefing. The Phantom's Revelation. The tension in the air was palpable. Gunnar stood in the center of the room, his arms crossed, eyes hard as he waited for Sofia and Alex to explain the details. But something in their demeanor, something in the way they looked at each other, set Gunnar's nerves on edge. Finally, Sofia spoke, her voice heavy with the weight of what she was about to reveal. "Gunnar, this is bigger than we thought. The mole inside our ranks. It wasn't just about leaking information. The leader of Black Dawn, the one behind everything, it's not who we thought." Gunnar's brow furrowed, but before he could speak, Alex cut in, her voice strained. "It was Trinity, Gunnar." The words hit him like a freight train. Trinity? No, it couldn't be. His mind rebelled against the very notion. Trinity had been his right hand, his most trusted confidant. They had fought side by side. How could she be the one behind it all? "No." His voice was hard, like a fist pounding against steel. "That's impossible." Sofia shook her head, her eyes filled with sorrow. "It's the truth. Trinity has been playing us all along. She's not just a mole. She's the Phantom, the leader of Black Dawn. She's been orchestrating everything, feeding us false information, manipulating every move we've made. She's been working with Ultranaecious from the start." Gunnar took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The Phantom? The leader of Black Dawn had always been a shadowy figure, the one enemy they could never quite get their hands on. And all this time, it had been Trinity, the person he trusted most. "Trinity?" He spat the name, his voice filled with disbelief and anger. "The Phantom? No. There has to be a mistake. She wouldn't—" "She would, and she did," Alex said, her voice bitter. "We have proof. We found communications, direct links between her and Ultranaecious. She's been planning this for years, manipulating you, all of us, to further her agenda. Gunner's fists clenched at his sides, rage bubbling beneath the surface. His mind raced back to every mission, every conversation, every moment of trust he had placed in her. How long had she been lying? How many times had she betrayed them without him even knowing? Sofia stepped forward, her voice quiet but resolute. Gunner, she's in custody now, locked up in Guantanamo Bay, but she hasn't said a word. She's waiting, buying her time. We believe she's still in contact with Ultranaecious, even from inside the prison. Whatever they're planning, it's not over. Gunner's heart pounded in his ears. Trinity, the Phantom, was alive, waiting. In Guantanamo Bay, the betrayal was like a knife twisting in his gut, but there was no time to dwell on the pain. There was only one thought in his mind now: Ultranaecious. She's not just a traitor, Gunner growled. She's been controlling everything, all this time, and I didn't see it. Chapter 3. Karina's briefing, Desera's injury and the return mission to find the orb. Karina's gaze met Gunner's, and she hesitated for a moment, knowing the weight of what she was about to revisit. You remember the mission at the Eastern European fortress? That's where we lost Desera's leg. We fought hard to save her that day, but it nearly broke us. Gunner's fists clenched at his sides, the memories of that mission still raw in his mind. He had been there, watching helplessly as the demon had torn into Desera's leg. The pain, the blood, and the panic of that moment had stayed with him ever since. We were fighting our way to Alexandra, Karina continued, her voice tense. We thought it was just another Black Dawn stronghold, but then the demons showed up. Desera was covering us, but one of them got through. You saw it. It tore through her leg like it was nothing. Ashley stepped in, her voice full of grim resolve. Jewel had to amputate right there on the floor. We were under attack and there was no time to get her out. If it wasn't for Aliana Vale, we wouldn't have made it. She saved all of us that day. Gunner's jaw tightened as he remembered how close they had come to losing Desera. He had been powerless to stop the demon's attack, and the memory of Desera's scream still echoed in his mind. But that's not where the story ends, Karina said, her voice hardening. After we got Desera out, we had to go back. You were off on your own quest for the Starlight Gem, but we couldn't let Black Dawn hold that place. We returned to the fortress, and that's when we found the orb. Sofia stepped forward, picking up the story. The fortress had been quiet since our first mission. We didn't expect to find much, but when we got inside, we realized Black Dawn had been hiding something deeper, something they hadn't even used the first time around. Karina nodded, her voice grave. That's when we found it, the orb. It was hidden deep in the fortress, buried behind layers of wards and traps. At first, we didn't know what it was, but when we brought it back, we realized the truth. Gunner's eyes narrowed. The orb? You're saying it was there all along, even when Desera was injured? Sofia shook her head. No, it wasn't active back then. Black Dawn hadn't tapped into its full power yet. But by the time we returned, something had changed. The orb is tied directly to Ultranaecious's realm. It's the key to bringing him back. Karina added, we had to recover it, but destroying it wasn't an option. If we had broken it, it might have opened the portal. That's why we gave it to Aliana Vale. She's safeguarding it in her world. The weight of it all settled on Gunner's shoulders. He had been there when Desera had lost her leg, fighting alongside her. Then, while he was off chasing the Starlight Gem, the team had gone back, facing those demons again and discovering the orb, the very thing that could bring Ultranaecious into their world. His voice was tight with frustration and guilt. I should have been there for that. We nearly lost Desera, and then you went back without me. I should have been with you. Sofia placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice calm but resolute. You were doing what needed to be done. Without the Starlight Gem, we wouldn't stand a chance against Ultranaecious. But now we need to act quickly. The more rituals Black Dawn performs, the closer they get to using the orb to bring him back. Ashley nodded. And if they succeed, not even Aliana can keep them from getting their hands on the orb. Chapter 4. Rest and reflection before building the workshop. The air was still as the portal closed behind them, the last echoes of battle fading into silence. Gunnar stood in the clearing, his shoulders tense, his mind racing through the events that had led them here. The battle with Black Dawn, the discovery of the orb, and the relentless fight to stay ahead of Ultranacious's forces, it all weighed heavily on him. But for now, they were safe. Beside him, Eli exhaled, her body visibly relaxing as the tension of the past few days began to lift. The Starlight Gem still hummed faintly at her side, its energy a constant reminder of the power they now possessed, but even that didn't erase the exhaustion in her eyes. "We made it," Eli said softly, her voice a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Gunnar nodded, though his mind was still focused on everything that lay ahead. The battles were far from over, but for the first time in days, they had a moment to breathe. "We should get some rest," Gunnar said, his voice quieter than usual. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us, but we won't get far if we don't recharge." Eli gave him a tired smile. "Agreed. It's been a long few days." As they made their way to the nearby safe house, Gunnar felt the weight of responsibility bearing down on him. The team had been through so much, and there was still more to come, but for now, they had to rest. They needed to be ready for whatever came next. The safe house was modest, tucked away in the forest, far from prying eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough, a place to gather their strength and regroup before diving headlong into the construction of the new workshop. Once inside, Eli moved to a chair by the window, letting the faint moonlight cast a soft glow across her face. She sat silently for a moment, watching the stars, her mind likely racing as fast as Gunnar's. He too felt the pull of exhaustion, but sleep wasn't easy for someone like him, not with so much at stake. "You should sleep," Eli said gently, as if reading his thoughts. "We're no good to anyone if we run ourselves into the ground." Gunnar sighed and nodded. He sat down across from her, the quiet of the room pressing in on him. The past few days had been brutal, and his body screamed for rest, but as soon as he closed his eyes, the memories of the battles, the demons, and Desera's screams echoed in his mind. "It's hard to let go," Gunnar admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Eli leaned back in her chair, understanding flickering in her eyes. "I know, but we have to, even if it's just for a few hours. There's no winning this if we're not at full strength." Gunnar knew she was right. The fight wasn't over, but that didn't mean they couldn't take a moment to breathe. He nodded again, letting the tension slowly seep out of his body as he leaned back in his chair. For a moment, silence filled the room. A silence that was both comforting and unnerving. The dawn light filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over the safe house. Gunnar stretched, feeling the tightness in his muscles from days of non-stop action. He glanced across the room to see Eli still asleep, her features softened in the quiet morning light. For the first time in what felt like ages, there was a sense of peace. He moved quietly to the window, looking out at the clearing beyond. Today, they would start construction, building the workshop they so desperately needed to stand a chance against Black Dawn. But before that, they needed to gather the team. Eli stirred behind him, blinking awake as the morning sun touched her face. She smiled softly. "Guess we survived the night." Gunnar chuckled. "We did, but now the real work starts." Eli sat up, stretching her arms. "I'm ready. What's the plan?" Gunnar moved to the table where they had laid out the blueprints for the workshop the night before. "First, we gather the others. We'll need all hands on deck to get this place up and running. After that, we'll start with the foundations and build up from there. We've got a lot to prepare. Weapon storage, reinforced walls, everything we'll need to stand our ground when the time comes." Eli nodded, a determined gleam in her eyes. "Then let's get to it." A few hours later, the team began to trickle into the clearing, ready to help with the workshop. Karina arrived first, her sharp eyes scanning the area as she took stock of what needed to be done. Ashley wasn't far behind, her sleeves already rolled up, ready to jump into the construction. Jewel and Bianca brought supplies, the medical gear they had gathered sitting neatly beside them. Sofia hadn't yet returned from her trip to the police department, But they knew she was working on gathering intel, finding any clue that might give them an edge against Black Dawn. As they began laying out materials and marking where the walls and storage would go, Gunnar felt a sense of purpose settle over him. This was what they needed, a safe space to prepare, to build, and to plan their next moves. The workshop would be their stronghold, the place where they could arm themselves and get ready for the final showdown. Under the midday sun, the team worked tirelessly. Eli was in her element, helping Gunnar sketch out the final designs for the weapon storage and forge. Her knowledge of alchemy and the Starlight Gem meant that the weapons they built would be stronger than anything Black Dawn had ever faced. Karina and Ashley worked side by side, constructing reinforced walls and planning defensive positions. Jewel set up a small medical station, ensuring that when the battles came, they would be ready to patch up any injuries. Gunnar looked around at his team, feeling a rare moment of hope. They were exhausted, battered, but still standing. They had come through worse before, and they would come through this too. But first, they had to build. The sound of hammers hitting steel and the hum of welding filled the air, and for the first time in days, Gunnar felt like they were finally making progress. The workshop was coming together, piece by piece, a symbol of their determination and resilience.